Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Thanks for joining everybody. This seminar is brought to you today by CIPS in partnership with S&P Global. So this is the second in a series of 3 seminars that we've been doing with S&P Global. Don't worry if you've missed the first one, we can get that link to you and you can watch that back on demand. And this one will be recorded as well. So if you want to watch it back, share it with colleagues afterwards, by all means do. We'll make sure the recording's available to you. And we'll also let you know when the next one is coming up as well, so you don't miss that one too. So all those links will be made available to you. This is the second, as I said, in a series of 3. And today we'll be talking about ESG and how transparency across supply chains is absolutely mission critical for organizations to strive. I'm Emma Scott. I'm Head of Content at CIPS, and I'll be hosting the discussion today. We've got some fantastic procurement experts joining us, and to share their insights, and I will run through who's going to be joining us as we go along. So we're going to start off the session today with a bit of a scene setter, a little bit of a helicopter view by our very own CIPS economist, Dr. John Glenn, who's going to be talking about sustainability and supply chains, but overlaid with that macroeconomic viewpoint on that. So hopefully that will set the scene in terms of feeding our discussion as our panelists join us later on. So please, if you've got any questions throughout the webinar, please make sure that you add them into the Q&A box so I can see them. I'll catch them there rather than the chat. And then hopefully we'll have time for a few questions with John before then we go over to our panel session. So without further ado, John, welcome.
Thank you, Emma. I'll just share my slides and we can get started. I know we're under a little bit of pressure for time. So yeah, I just want to look at the macroeconomic context and particularly how international supply chains can achieve sustainability in a very, very volatile landscape that we exist in. If you've got any questions at the end, please ask them. If you've got any questions that you don't get the chance to ask, you'll notice that my email is there. So please email me and I'll endeavour to get back to you as quick as I can. So the challenge is, we've got to look at this volatile external environment, which is as volatile and providing many macroeconomic challenges that we haven't faced for a long time, particularly in relation to inflation, or at least in Western European and North American economies. We've got sustainability goals where we know that from a global perspective, we're under enormous pressure to deliver sustainability goals and are frankly failing to a worrying extent to match those goals. And then we've got the issue of supply chain integrity. So we have supply chain professionals that I've worked with for years who frankly people haven't known about. They didn't know you existed because you did such a wonderful job. Our supply chains worked wonderfully. It allowed us to have just-in-time production where we source from all over the world. We're able to source the best in terms of price, quality, and the productivity of our partners. And now, post-COVID, post-Ukraine war, and post some challenges that we face in the United Kingdom with the dreaded B word, have caused issues with supply chain integrity. Our macroeconomic environment then is exceptionally challenging. We have inflation, the like of which we've not seen in a generation, at least for 30 years. We have the threat of economic recession, particularly in Europe and most obviously close to home in the United Kingdom. And then we have a labour market that, given that we're in recession, given that the economy is slowing down, is behaving in an atypical way. So post-COVID, we've got the Great Resignation, where we've seen around 400,000 people leave the labour market. Many of them of a similar age to me. The significant amount of resignation has come from people who are 50 to 65. Maybe it's because it's the end of the defined benefit pension people. So that's the last part of that cohort, that tranche of individuals who had significant defined benefit pension rights that they built up, and they chose post-COVID to exercise those rights, and if not retire completely, like myself, retire partially. Okay, so we have this issue where the labour market is incredibly tight. It's difficult hiring people, and yet the economy is going into recession, and we've got a lot of inflation. The inflation that we experience is cost inflation, not demand-driven inflation. So it's cost inflation due to the war in Ukraine, increasing food prices, increasing fuel prices. It's cost inflation due to the fact that our supply chains are broken down and we're not able to source from a low cost context such as China. And frankly, we've feasted on cheap money and on cheap output from China for a long time, cheap money generally. And that creates a big problem for the people in the bottom right, who are the Bank of England. Now, the Bank of England governor has said that 80% of inflation is beyond his control. So the governor can control what we call demand inflation by putting interest rates up and trying to slow the economy down. Putting interest rates up isn't going to solve the problem of the Ukraine war. It isn't going to solve the lack of food. It isn't going to solve supply chain fractures, and it isn't going to solve fuel prices having gone up. Okay, so we have a danger that we over react in terms of interest rates, and we trash the economy in order to get rid of inflation. Now, if we absolutely cause the economy to collapse, and you know, some people have said, you know, we could have unemployment at 2.5 to 3 million, the sort of, you know, unemployment that we experienced in the early 80s in the first Thatcher administration, then, you know, that's a big price to pay to get our economy working. So we have, as we mentioned, enormous supply chain challenges, be they fires in chip factories, be they, you know, evergreen carriers in the Suez Canal, be it, you know, issues getting our goods in and out of Europe, okay, be it zero COVID policies in China, which means that China is slowing down and the ports are slowing down. Obviously, that port issue is starting to resolve itself, but we still have issues with, you know, containers not being in the right part of the world. We still have issues with, you know, lorry drivers not being available to bring goods in and out of the port to distribution centers. And then we have the environmental challenge sort of bottom center, which means, you know, occasional floods, occasional fires are fracturing our supply chains in a way that is incredibly unpredictable. And then we have the war in Ukraine, which has enormous impact on fuel prices, most obviously gas, and, you know, the fact that, you know, Russia supplies 3.4 million barrels a day of oil into the global economy. We're obviously putting that under embargo, which means that we then have to look at producers of swing capacity in the global oil industry, and we're looking at areas, you know, exploring stuff that we can get out of Iran, for example, who would quite conveniently produce about 3.5 million barrels a day if we let them, and Venezuela. So obviously we're dealing with providers of oil, but very unstable regimes. Okay, so future risks that we have to manage here. This is a fabulous piece of work that was done by McKinsey's. I have copies of it, so I'm more than willing to share it, where they looked at on the bottom axis about how much time do we get to be made available, to be made aware or to anticipate a particular risk. And then on the vertical axis, they looked at how much does it cost us if the risk materialized. So systematic cyber attack, I'll talk in a moment. Extreme pandemic, we had weeks where we were able to anticipate it, and then the cost to the global economy is in tens of trillions of dollars. We've also seen with the local military conflict, we maybe had longer to anticipate that it was going to impact the global economy, but its impact on the global economy runs into hundreds of billions of dollars. The one that I think going forward that worries me the most is a systemic cyber attack. So we have to make sure that our IT facilities, our IT capabilities, our information ICT capabilities are robust, that our organizations have systems in place in terms of how we would deal with the systemic cyber attack, because that's a future risk that we have to manage. In terms of supply chains and sustainability, there's a super document that was produced by the World Economic Forum in 2021, which looked at the net zero challenge that's facing supply chain and looked at the opportunities that are available to supply chain. I've included the link to the URL if you want to read it when my slides are published. I'm sure somebody can publish them for us. And essentially what that document says is we need to focus on the big 8 supply chains. So eight supply chains count for more than 50% of global CO2 emissions. And if we could fully decarbonize these, it would just add 1 to 4% to the end customer cost for many everyday items. So that second point is enormously important, because what we've seen in recent times is people saying, well, if we continue to decarbonize the economy, there's a cost associated with that. The cost is associated with that in high inflationary times. We're not prepared to do it. And, to use an appalling metaphor in this context, we put the environment on the back burner. Okay, which is not what we need to do. We're saying that the impact on consumers would be relatively small, and obviously the benefit to the global economy would be enormous if we could decarbonize these supply chains. Obviously, you're all sitting there thinking, come on, John, tell us who they are. So we're looking at food, construction, FMCG, fashion, electronics, automotive, professional services, and the freight industry, which I work in quite a lot. So we have to go after these big 8, focus on them, focus on decarbonizing them, because they're the supply chains that give us the biggest bangs for our bucks, where the impact on bucks is not that great. And the key issues that we can look at there, some, when you say, oh, decarbonize it, John, or give us a clue what we can do, and the report goes into greater detail on that, but 3 or 4 of the things that sort of stood out for me was revisiting product design choices, looking at geographical sourcing strategies, setting ambitious procurement standards in terms of decarbonisation in order to create the incentive to do so, and working jointly with suppliers to co-fund abatement levers. So where there is cost in the supply chain, making sure that that cost is spread across the supply chain in an appropriate manner, particularly from those individuals who are making bigger margin in the supply chain, to make sure that we actually fund the cost of abatement on the supply side, on the producer side, in a way that is more equitable. Okay. So in order to achieve all this, I'm going to suggest that we need a mindset change, and a document that I use a lot. It's a Harvard Business Review paper, 1999. But when I'm teaching my students, I say I don't apologize for the fact that it's that old, because the paper by Donald Sull, which he eventually put into a book, is called Why Good Companies Go Bad. Okay. And essentially what we're saying here is that the environmental change, now I'm using environmental here in its broadest sense rather than the specific sense of the environment. So what the blue line represents is the pace at which our stakeholders are changing. So the pace at which our stakeholders are asking us to deliver change is represented by the blue line. The red line represents the pace at which we're actually enacting change. And there, what you can see is initially we get a situation where if we're not changing at a fast enough rate, we get this gap between the blue and the red line. We call that strategic drift. Okay. And the key issue then is we go into phase 3 is that we actually start doing things, but we start doing the wrong things. So we get active, there is action. People know that there is a challenge. They know that there is action. The problem is there's inappropriate action. So we get action that doesn't lead to going anywhere. We get active inertia. The gap gets bigger, and then we have an issue that we either transform what it is that we're doing and catch up with what the environment is asking of us, or we end up demising. Okay, I'm conscious of time here, so I'm going to take you through. So what are these drivers of active inertia? I'll finish on this. First of all, the way in which we view our world strategically is not broad enough. We rule out strategic options because we stick to the same old tried and tested methods of the past. Processes that we have become wedded to, that have worked for us in the past, that we're comfortable with, become routines that we fail to challenge. So there's a significant amount of process engineering that has to be done. Relationships that we've had, both with employees and third parties, become shackles that prevent us from doing things that we need to do. And lastly, values that have inspired and unified people become dogmas that stop us doing things. Example of the last point, we work with the European Patent Office quite a lot. They value quality. So you put your patent application in, the guy who's examining it, they expect, or he or she expects, that they'll be able to write a quality judgment. But now their customers, their stakeholders are requiring not only quality, but timeliness. Not only quality, but timeliness and ability to work with other examiners, because their patent application is so difficult. And the values of collaboration, the values of timeliness are working against, are hitting up against this value of quality of judgment. And so you see that the dogma can stop you from doing things that you need to do. Okay, that was a whistle-stop tour through those slides. Apologize for having to go so quickly. Emma, I think we might have time for one or two questions.
Yeah, we've got a question through that I might leave for our panel, but if anyone's got a quick question for John, by all means, pop it in now. But yeah, John, I think that was really interesting about the kind of the what mindsets we need to change in terms of getting a handle on this, but also kind of realization that actually either the cost of doing something or the cost to the end customer doesn't always have to be crippling.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of sustainability approaches and strategies are so interlinked with what you would be doing under risk and resilience that it's like, why wouldn't you do some of these things? They're so interlinked. So I guess it's to stop looking at things in isolation and changing those mindsets, I think is probably two key takeaways I would take away from that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you.
Great stuff.
Guys, enjoy
John,
the rest of your seminar, and
thank you so much for joining us. That was a great start to for our conversation. So thanks, John. Thanks very much indeed.
Take it easy now.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask our panelists to join us. So Maria, Roger, and Kevin, if you'd like to come on, and I will just ask you to all just introduce yourselves now, and then we'll start off with some questions. So Maria, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Eugenia Ceballos. I am the Group Head of Sustainable Procurement at Holcim. My responsibilities are to move the inertia that we were talking before, so to action, to mobilize the full company on Scope 3, reducing CO2 emissions from our supply chain, and also on the due diligence process, doing proper due diligence with all our suppliers around the world. So I lead the programs in the group, and I act with the procurement professionals in the company. Still, I am sitting in the sustainability department, reporting to the Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer, but with a dotted line to our Chief Procurement Officer.
Great stuff. Great to have you on board. Thank you. Kevin?
Hi, Emma. Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Bourne. I'm the Head of Investment Research for ESG and Climate Change at S&P Sustainable One. Increasingly being engaged with companies on issues linked to their supply chains and the ESG and climate requirements that are coming their way is becoming a more regular part of my role.
Excellent. And last but not least, Roger.
Yes, thanks, Emma, and hi, everyone. So I'm Rogier Binsberg. I'm a director in S&P Global, responsible for KY3P, which stands for Know Your Third Party, which is a comprehensive third-party risk management solution. So we include several products and services focusing on the management of the end-to-end supplier or third-party risk management lifecycle. And within KY3P, I'm responsible for the business strategy and the business development in the EMEA region. It's great to be here and have this opportunity actually to talk about ESG, but also in the context of supply chain and third-party risk management, because as you already heard from John Glenn, ESG is really in a perfect storm, but as well as TPRM. So both topics together face incredible challenges, all the challenges that John already mentioned, but on the other hand, also all kinds of regulations that are coming our way, and the supervisory scrutiny and compliance challenges that emerge from that. So happy to be here today and clarify a little bit more on those challenges.
Excellent, thanks. My first question will come to you actually. So, in today's interconnected, globalized marketplace, an organization's ESG footprint can grow exponentially in size, reach, and complexity, really. So how does an organization go about mapping its entire supply chain, and just how difficult is it to get that full picture of what's going on?
Yeah, that is a very crucial question. I mean, if we talk about third-party risk management and supplier risk management, interchangeably, you can use that. This is one of the first steps that you do, right? You have to have a visibility on all your suppliers, and in particular your tier 1 suppliers. And to immediately answer the question, it's complex, and it's potentially getting more complex depending on the type of organization. So if you distinguish two types of organizations, so service-led organizations and organizations that have a more physical supply chain, I mean, both have a large variety of suppliers, and again, depending on the size, sometimes goes into thousands, 10,000 of suppliers. That already shows how complex it can be. But the width and the depth of the supply chain is what makes it so complex. So if you think about manufacturing companies or electronics, automotive, construction, FMCG that John also highlighted earlier, those become very complex. They have direct suppliers, but they use finished or semi-finished products. And that means that their direct suppliers use suppliers as well. So there's 4th, 5th, 6th parties that becomes potentially very complex. So to go to your question, how do you do that? Well, it starts with having a good view on your tier 1 suppliers and onboarding them, performing a risk assessment on them, but especially having a good collaboration. So in that stage, you have to understand also their supply chain, the suppliers that they work with. And that just comes through good collaboration. But here it's also very important that you use the right tools, that you use the right data, external data potentially, to get insights in that. And there are a variety of tools out there that can help you gaining insight on that 4th, 5th supplier base. So again, collaboration with your first tier 1 suppliers, and then using external data to either challenge that or to increase that visibility. And in that map, it's also very important that you understand your critical suppliers in particular.
Yeah.
So from a resilience perspective, when supply chain shocks happen, right? I mean, these are your suppliers that are fundamental for delivering your products, and you need to understand those. But in the context of ESG, it's also important to understand how are they performing actually from an environmental perspective or from a human rights perspective. You want those suppliers to be robust and sustainable, and to drive that also through their 4th, 5th, and 6th parties in the supply chain. And I think we have a couple of examples of companies that are doing that quite well. BMW is, for example, one of them. And one regulation that is upcoming in Europe is the Supply Chain Act in Germany. And this is public information, so I consult everyone to go to that website of the German Supply Chain Act. BMW is quite expressive of how they did that, understanding their critical suppliers, understanding their critical parts, and using that. So that's the second step, understanding your critical suppliers, and then build that map. And the key enabler here is automation. You need to have a tool to be able to onboard all your third parties, your suppliers, and link them to those 4 parties and 6 parties. Otherwise, it becomes impossible. So yes, it's possible. It's heavy work. Good collaboration is needed with your suppliers, but you also need data and tools to support that.
Excellent, thanks. Maria, tell us a little bit about how you approach this. And I suspect having that open dialogue and conversation running with suppliers is absolutely critical.
I fully agree with all the concepts shared by Roger. Always when there is an example, it came the automotive, which is a good example for transparency in the supply chain. And as he said, it's challenging for other sectors. In our case, we have 100,000 suppliers around the world. Luckily, we are at the beginning of the supply chain. So my company, we produce building materials. So we have a very close relationship with our tier 1 suppliers. Still, we have a bunch of money spent on equipment because our factories are high tech and we need equipment. And of course, the components, then you need to go to the tier 2, tier 3. We are applying the concept that Roger just said. And we try to use the same tool that uses automotive companies. And it's fantastic. So you give them, so first of all, you need to know who are the suppliers, what are the risky supply chain, because with 100,000, we are not doing everything with all suppliers. So we focus on the high challenge supply chains. We have our tier 1 suppliers. You give these numbers and these names you put it in this platform, and through artificial intelligence and through public information, they can map with whom these companies are doing business. So then you increase a bit transparency in your supply chain. But this beauty has a limitation. When there are international transactions, they can find with artificial intelligence all these business relationship. But when the transaction happen in the domestic market, the information might not be public, and this is a limitation. In our case, more than 90% of the suppliers are from the domestic markets, and they are also majority SMEs. So when we build this transparency, we need to put an extra effort, and this is the pain of the process. You will need to contact your suppliers and ask them to have a more accurate monitoring of the ESG in your extended supply chain. You will need to ask them from whom you buy.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you are a supplier and say, why you want to know who are my suppliers? You want to skip on me. So building the relationship, targeting the suppliers and focusing the effort is key. So you can monitor and make an effort, and it is a very big journey on this due diligence. We started in our company 10 years ago. Our tier 1 suppliers by end of this year, 100% are with a proper due diligence, and now we are from next year putting more effort on the tier 2 suppliers. But it's a long journey, and it's not a magic tool that will give you the solutions.
No, and I guess that point about being open and transparent about what the goals are and what the roles and responsibilities are. So there's no hidden agenda here. Just making that clear, I think, on what's expected of suppliers early on is really, and that helps to build trust and then be more forthcoming with information, I would have thought too. Yeah.
Exactly.
Kevin, if I could move the conversation onto you a little bit. So not only is it the size and the reach and the complexity of your supply base, but it's also the scope of all the issues that we're trying to tackle here, from climate to human rights to all sorts of different different ESG issues. So what sort of data should organizations be collecting, or indeed buying in? And what are some of the challenges in setting and recording and tracking goals against some of these?
Thank you, Emma. And I was thinking about this question before the event and thinking, how do you answer a question that could in its own right take 3 hours in 3 minutes? And I think the conclusion I came to was that fundamentally you have to be incredibly disciplined and ultimately assume that you're going to need everything. Now, that's not a great starting point, because that means probably cost. So when I look at the companies I work with, they all have systems and processes to maintain data about their counterparts. That's a given. They have to have that because they're obviously engaged with them commercially. And I thought to myself, well, what's the next level down if we're looking at ESG? So I have my little vertical table in front of me. So the next thing I think you need to understand, are you reporting static data, or are you looking for active data? The two are very different, and that's got a lot to do with regulation. Most ESG data that is available is static. It's based on historic information. But if you look at what's happening in the regulation around supply chains, there's an increasing element of active information that's required. Now, very often the definition of active is not included. Does it mean you have to check every day, every month? I'm starting to see increasingly regulators saying directors are liable if they do not check. Well, that's very interesting. It's not just that you've got something that's going on. What if you don't check, and what if somebody checks to see if you're checking? So first thing, do you have the information? Second thing, are you looking for reporting data that's historic? Are you looking for a more active environment? Then I thought, well, are you looking at the company's ESG profile? So are you after ESG data on your counterpart? Or, and this is increasingly arriving, are you looking for ESG data on your counterpart's products? The two are different.
Yeah.
Individual products and services that your suppliers deliver to you have ESG profiles. It's not just RoHS, does the component meet RoHS standards? The product itself has its own ESG profile, and that's an incredibly complex world because there are billions of products. And then is the information you're going to construct in your internal data model on your suppliers. Is it going to be actual data that you've collected, and where do you get that from? To your point, do you buy it? Do you build it by putting technology onto your suppliers and asking them to fill in something online? Or do you use estimates? In financial markets, fund managers, banks are increasingly having to use estimates for various components of the ESG journey, simply because the actual data isn't available. So then you get into all sorts of issues. If you're going to use estimates, will the regulators or your counterparts accept that you've had to use estimated data? How those estimates calculated, and whoever's doing that work, is their work of a certain standard that you can use it? And then finally, again, something that often gets missed, once you've collected all this data, what are you going to do with it? Mm-hmm. Are you going to put it in a box in the corner of one of your factories? Well, that doesn't work. So collecting the data, you have to do something with it. So what does the data tell you? Well, it can tell you, is your supply chain Paris aligned? It can tell you potentially the climate impairment of your suppliers based on their physical locations. So I think it's not just the issue of collecting and reporting it. I think what you're going to find increasingly is that companies are going to say, how does that information build into your overall systemic risk profile as a company? So the sorts of things that the banks are getting asked now, I just see that coming down the line to the corporates as well.
Excellent. That's a really good point. And if I can link to some, Colin has asked quite a complex question. There's lots of questions within his question, so I'm going to pick out a little bit of that while we're talking about this. And it's about the reliability of the source of some data as well. Like, you know, how much scrutiny should we be putting over there? And again, and when we set our goals, should we be setting them against some kind of benchmarks, or should we be, should we lose our own internal benchmarks? So, Kevin, and I don't know if you want to tackle that first one on perhaps integrity of data.
That's always a challenge. Now, obviously, there's an obligation for any public company and for any company to publish data that's materially correct. We also know that doesn't happen all the time. And also we understand that the cost of checking your counterparts in great detail, your suppliers, is incredibly expensive and beyond the economics of most businesses to do beyond a certain point. So we do have just to make a point, we do have a challenge where the legislation might be expecting more of industry than industry can actually deliver. And there's a big debate in the EU about that with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive at the moment. The data is what the data is. I think what you are going to see is a move towards using data from trusted third parties, and you're going to have to accept that the data that is used, if it's sourced, is sourced on a best endeavors, best efforts type basis, because if somebody is not telling the truth, there's very little you can do about it. Interestingly, when we do carbon emissions calculations on companies independently of what the company provides us, we often find there's a delta. We'll approach the company and say, are you sure? And they will show us some fairly rudimentary emissions calculations they've done. We show them ours and they go, oh, that's really interesting. Can we use this, please? So it's not that the companies are necessarily being deliberately misleading. I think for most of them, the problem is this is new. They've not done
and
this
it's
before.
complex. Yeah, exactly that. Maria, what kind of benchmarks do you put in place, or do you use any benchmarks against, where you want to be against best in class, or are you setting your own ambitious targets? How do you go about that?
But before talking about the targets and the benchmark, I would like to elaborate because Kevin put a very nice tone on the conversation. Static data versus dynamic data. You need both data. In our case, I wanted to give an example. What we have is our due diligence process on the companies, because also you put companies or products. So the due diligence process in general is the one derived from the OECD guidelines, and you go to the companies for this human rights and all the as part of the ESG, S&G. So what we have is the annual update of the questionnaire that is started with our supplier code of conduct. So we have our company, you don't see it, but it's the company supplier code of conduct. Not an invention, it's like every company has, is derived through the United Nations Global Compact and Principles. So then we have a questionnaire. Yes, you can use a tool. We have regional solutions, and the suppliers will answer this tool on an annual basis. So this will be the static part of the data. But then you need to actively monitor this ESG performance. And then you have other tools like I'm allowed to mention some, for example, rep risk. You will monitor any controversy that happened and is captured in the media. What happened, as I said, my suppliers are SMEs from domestic markets. They will not be in rep risk. So we are exploring other platforms to also capture, even from social media, from Facebook, all these ESG breaches or potential violations. So to be proactive. So you need a combination of the static and the dynamic data. And then the reliability of the data is in line with the accountability. So if my category manager, and we go back to the starting point that Roger said, you need to know your suppliers. And you need to know what are the risks they bring to our company. And based on this, you, category manager, sign a contract and you are bringing this risk to our company. So is the accountability, because in our process, you are supposed to check some basics due diligence, and then it comes to the reliability. It's a self-assessment, or you will ask for facts and evidence of your answers, or for some categories, we request also to go and to conduct the on-site audit. Yeah. So this is, you need to balance all this effort. Then you come with targets. For us, the due diligence is not an ambitious target, it's a compliance target. So the procurement people has to know that we don't want to put risk in the company, so there is a target. Of course, we acknowledge the pace in the different regions. We have a footprint in Middle East and Africa, in Latin America, North America, Europe. So this due diligence or reaching the standards expected will take more time. So there is also an effort, and then answering what Kevin said, what do you do with the data? It's not a blacklisting suppliers, it's understanding from the suppliers that we need to work with them when we don't have the leverage in the market and you need to work with the suppliers, then you need to put actions and work with them to achieve or to improve the standards, the ESG standards. So these are the targets in the due diligence. The benchmark for us, so we need to be 100%. And if there is no agreeing supplier, we need to have an action plan in place to manage the risk. But then if I have to talk on the product, this is another approach because basically the company due diligence and also the contractors coming into our factory, we do a diligence also in the people entering in our factory. But on the other part of the supply chain, when you need to understand the E of the product or the ESG of the product, yes, I agree there. You use some secondary data. We have our Scope 3 emissions, the full inventory. we use a combination of data. Some are direct data, and others you have to go to sources for fuel consumption of the trucks or things like that. And at the end, these are helping you to drive business decisions to decarbonize our supply chain.
Thank you, Maria. If I can pick up on that point that you made and pass this question back to Rogier to bring that you back in here. Is the focus too much on compliance? And, are we in a little bit of a risk of going through a tick boxing exercise, some organizations here, in addressing ESG? And should CPOs instead be looking at ESG as a way of creating value? And I guess we could also add into that, going back to John's at the beginning, of understanding where that inertia comes from, really. And is that part of it? Or are we really worried about our compliance and our legal teams all driving us to, this is what we've got to do as a minimum to get away with it, rather than doing our best efforts?
Yeah, again, good question. I think John also mentioned, right? So supply chains are the game changer. So that means that there is actually value in that supply chain. But if you look at it from due diligence, performing due diligence, risk assessments, TPRM, I mean, risk is in the name, right? So I think maybe not so much compliance, but reduce risk is actually the perspective. And this is, of course, fundamental. So to go back to my previous comments about identifying critical suppliers and managing that closely, the core objective is that you ensure that your supply chain is resilient against any shocks, potential risks. And in itself, that is already a way of protecting value, right? But to look at it from another perspective, so really from a value creation perspective, I mean, investing in ESG, I think there are already several studies that actually show that companies who invested, or investors who invested in ESG, they yield higher returns. So it means that there is a value in that. And going back to the risk perspective, we also see actually that companies who do better on the ESG front and have a better ESG footprint also have lower credit risk scores, or better credit risk scores. And in the end, that can then also again result in lower funding costs, creating value. So as a CPO, as a procurement officer, being in charge of the supply chain and allocating firms' capital into different areas, I mean, they have a very important role to play. Maybe more indirectly, investing in ESG also means investing in maybe human rights, labor, etc., diversity. And we also all know that, I mean, investing in that can boost employee satisfaction, can have a more productive workforce in the end. So it's more maybe an indirect way of looking at it, but also again, a value creation way. And then maybe at the last end, I mean, costs, right? I mean, they don't necessarily create value, but for your cash flow, that's obviously an important element. Energy savings, for example. If you look at transportation companies, there are transportation companies that are for years already trying to move their whole transportation line from fossil fuel transportation to electric engines. Well, at the moment, with the big energy crisis and prices going up, they have a really big advantage. At the same time, they're reducing their carbon footprint. So I think there are several ways of looking at it, that it adds value. Yes, I believe that there is value in it. And that the CPO can make a fundamental difference. And maybe to go back to John's point. So yeah, I think the key is in the supply chain, and that can be a game changer.
And perhaps some of this is down to, and we've had a question from Mohammed come through about this inertia. Perhaps some of this comes from organizational culture. You know, how serious is your organization taking it from an overarching perspective on these issues? And you know, if it does become part of your ethos as an organization and what you stand for, then perhaps that's when inertia starts to wane a bit more. I guess everyone's nodding in agreement there, but if there's any additional comment that you want to make about that, how important is it to get that top-down stamp of approval on this is what we stand for and this is what we're going to do?
You go, Maria,
Kevin,
please.
No, please.
oh,
No,
Maria,
no.
go on, Kevin, and then we'll come to you in a sec, Kevin. Go on.
Okay, what I can share from our company now, sustainability, and I invite you to see in the website our business strategy. Sustainability is the license to survive of any company. Okay, and it is from the top down is the company culture. And as Roger said, it is an opportunity. It is a cost savings. It is a future-proven supply chain. Okay, and there are fantastic external forces shaping the business culture. The regulations, like Roger said, the due diligence in Germany, but now becoming mandatory in the EU. So you have a compliance part, but this compliance is pushing the business. And then you have also the market, the disruption or the increase in energy pricing or the scarcity of papers. And so it is forcing all this thinking, and it's naturally going more sustainable. You reduce costs and you ensure a long-term supply chain. And this is what is happening in my company. Our CPO, I produced the concept, what is sustainable procurement? And then he translated on the procurement strategy that he named sustainable competitiveness. Because we want to scale up, we have a power to scale up and make an impact. Yes, we want to buy electric trucks and get rid of the heavy duty vehicles on diesel. And today in a call with the country, because we are launching this sustainable competitiveness, a colleague from Croatia say, I want to buy. Yes, but you don't have yet. In that market, the OEMs don't have the technology or the infrastructure of the renewable energy to charge, to power this. So there is a transition, and you might leverage biofuels. And we have this roadmap that goes beyond compliance. It goes to ensuring this long-term sustainability that is low emissions and also lower cost.
Thanks,
It
Maria.
is a
Kevin.
big moment, yeah.
Kevin.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when I look at this issue, as Roger mentioned, between is it risk or is it opportunity? What is really important, I think, for all companies to understand is that banks are being asked to report on the systemic risk within their balance sheets, i.e. the lending decisions they make. And when a bank is going to interrogate companies going forward, they're just going to say, what is the ESG footprint or the climate footprint, the impairment risk of your business in its factories or offices. They're also going to include your supply chain. And if you don't have that data available, you are going to receive different terms because they're going to come under pressure from the regulators to differentiate commercial relationships, lending relationships based on the risk profile that includes supply chain for obvious reasons. And that, to me, is often something that doesn't get missed. It's nice to hear that companies do make this internal link between these issues. Many don't. But in terms of its importance and the focus for companies, I look at what's just happened, say, in Finland, where the Finnish government have said, if you are a Finnish company and you have all of these new challenges and responsibilities coming along, we're going to help you by leveraging our embassies globally to act as conduits for supply chain, local data on the countries that you otherwise might not be able to get because we're in a privileged position and we are there on a permanent basis. So the Finnish government realized that the opening up of supply chain monitoring by industry and by commerce, by the world in total, is an issue of competitiveness, and they must, as a country, support their domestic companies by helping them understand what's going on in different countries where they have suppliers. That, to me, is real foresight by government, picking up and doing that. And I hope other governments end up doing the same, because it's an intelligent use of their resources to support their domestic enterprise. But it also, to me, more than anything else, highlights the challenges that they believe industry will have, and I think they're completely correct. I see nothing other than a really complex challenge ahead as we have greater and greater expectations for the availability of data and what we can do with it versus what we actually can achieve at the moment.
Absolutely. And building on that, so typically companies have responded by cutting carbon in their direct operations, but we know that 70+% sits within the supply chain, the scope 3 emissions when it comes to carbon. And as custodians of the supply chain, and I don't know if we've linked this to the inertia conversation again, but will we see a future where procurement professionals are being measured as much on carbon reduction as they are on cost savings? Will it take that, do you think, to enact real change at pace? Kevin, if you want to go first.
I'll take the first story, and that's a I can answer that in many different ways. But I think the decision would be taken out of companies' hands, because at some point I cannot see that there is not going to be, at least on a much broader scale, maybe G20 composite carbon pricing. Everything we're trying to do to rapidly reduce emissions at the moment we're not enjoying the success we know we need. And I think at some point we'll move on to phase 2, which has got to be carbon pricing. We did it with SOx and NOx in the 1970s and 80s, for those that are old enough to remember acid rain, and it worked. Yes, there was a bit of shuffling around of where factories were, but ultimately it solved the problem. At some point, I think carbon pricing is coming that will achieve that. There's some low-level versions of that, i.e. not specifically targeted globally, already coming in the EU and the US with the carbon border taxes. So carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU, slightly different to the US model, but basically saying if you want to sell into Europe, or you want products in Europe used in European products, so you can't come in with a lower emissions footprint operating model than domestic European companies have, and you're going to have to buy carbon credits to cover the delta. So you're already seeing supply chains impacted because these products that are imported into Europe, and it's only limited industries to start with, but it will cascade, I'm sure, to everything, are being taxed at source when they come into the EU in the relatively near future anyway.
And Maria, are procurement teams in your organisation measured on these targets? Are you seeing a move to a more wider range of procurement measures for their team's performance?
Our procurement teams and the top management in the company, they are measured for CO2 reduction, for water reduction, and for our waste recovery ratio. So they have a performance bonus linked to these KPIs.
Yeah.
So yes, they are looking at this. About the carbon pricing, it would be, so I think it's a good mechanism to accelerate, especially for sectors like us, hard to abate. Carbon tax, it will be an excellent news for architects, and that they will, so because everybody wants low carbon products and nobody wants to pay the carbon cost. So we are, our emissions, scope 1 and 2 are much bigger than our scope 3 so far. This is different than the most of the other companies. So, you know, cement sector, to produce cement, you emit a lot of CO2 just for the raw material we use. When you hit the stones, you release the CO2 from the stone, plus the energy you use on the to make this chemical change. So with the carbon pricing, we can force, because there are also the standards for building, that you need to use a lot of material, and you can really use less materials and have the same performance. So all this carbon pricing will make a mindset, how much, if now that I have to pay, because today cement is cheaper than water. Now, if there is a tax on carbon and the cement is the most intense product in my building, I will think how much I will use. I will use it better. And this is the purpose of our company, to influence the built environment, to build better with less. But we need carbon pricing.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. We had a question through. The question is, what do you do when you know the blind spots through supply chain transparency, specifically with the German legislation, which I'm not attempting to pronounce? From a practical standpoint, most of the organizations are avoiding this and the need to act on it. What are your thoughts? And I guess, Roger, this links back to the kind of a discussion we want to pick up on due diligence as well.
Yeah, so on due diligence and the due diligence process, I think Maria already elaborated a little bit on how they do that within Holcim. But it's good to mention, first of all, that there are already different regulations and expectations coming out in this area, right? Kevin touched already about CS3D, so the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive that is in the proposal phase. We have the German Supply Chain Act that is becoming active in the 1st of January. Then there are more detailed requirements on raw materials, conflict minerals, 3TG due diligence requirements. We have the COM 453 that is focusing on prohibiting products with forced labor. And I think, as Maria already mentioned, like all of them are in a kind of way also referring to this UN guiding principles, right? So that was already mentioned. Before maybe going into due diligence and how that process should look like, I mean, although these regulations exist, they're still principle-based and sort of high level in a kind of way. And there is no in-depth guidance on how to perform that due diligence. Like there is no standardized framework. And in other areas of supplier risk management, TPRM, like for example, cyber risk, we actually see that there are standards there, there are control objectives. And I just want to make this point because I think this is a crucial one. We need a kind of harmonization of standards here. I mean, if every company starts to do due diligence by itself and send out questionnaires to vendors, suppliers, first of all, that's an heavy operational task for the company itself, but it also becomes a very operational heavy task for the vendors. Imagine you have to reply to different companies' questionnaires for the same topics. That's challenging. So harmonization of standards is crucial from that perspective. And when companies do that, they can actually potentially, when we have a harmonization of standards, leverage each other's assessments, brings enormous efficiency. And from a risk perspective, it's better as well, I think, because then the comparability between those becomes better. So there was, I think, also a question earlier made, how can we rely this data? If we have a harmonization of standards and controls, and the industry start replying to that in a systematic way, the risk scoring can be done much better as well. So that harmonization is a key point. Then maybe attached to that also supervision is a crucial point, because we can have all those regulations, but when we have no supervision, we all know what's going to happen. Nobody's going to comply with it. And that is also a very big challenge. We see now sort of, it's a good way that Germany is moving forward, their front runner. But we should ensure that there is no divergence in this field, right? All the supervisors needs to be aligned on that as well and supervise this, and that's a heavy task as well. Going back to the due diligence, so how to do that? I think it's a combination of using data and doing a due diligence. I think that is a crucial element. On your critical suppliers, the point that I made earlier, you have to perform a due diligence. You have to know how they act. You have to know literally everything that they do from an ESG perspective, but from a risk perspective in general. But with having external data, you can do an initial screening for the rest of your suppliers from a potential risk perspective. And here you can set sort of parameter. You screen them with the help of an external data provider. You understand what are the potential risk areas, and maybe with those suppliers, you can do an in-depth due diligence on those elements. Again, potentially via a harmonized framework. I think that is very important. In this way, you can bring major efficiency in that process. And again, if you have 10,000 suppliers, you can never do a due diligence on all of them. That's going to be impossible. So you have to make that shift.
We do. It took us 10 years.
No, exactly. Yeah. And then you have to reperform it, right? Monitoring
annual updates. Yeah.
So using that data for initial screening and continuous monitoring is important. Then to shift where you want to do the in-depth due diligence, or where you have to do the in-depth due diligence. So I think that is there's a crucial point of the due diligence question.
And yes, that's quite a long time, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for all the questions that have come through. That kind of brings us to an end. So I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to, in turn, just give their, in light of all the issues that are going on in the world, and John tapped on a lot of those in his presentation this morning. Have we dampened expectations on efforts to go forward and drive some of these initiatives, or is it that resources are so scarce because we're looking at all these different things and trying to juggle so many things? We've lived through uncertain and volatile times, but perhaps not as much all at once as how we are at the moment. So given all of that, what would your top 3 priorities or top 1 or 2 priorities be for CPOs and their ESG agendas over the next 12 months, given how scarce resources and efforts are? Kevin, do you want to go first?
Oh, nice. It's no good going first on this one, is that? So number 1, leverage technology. You cannot do this without technology. Number 2, become educated on how ESG works. Understand how scores are constructed. Understand what it means. Understand how you can use it. So you're not just collecting data, you're actually doing something with it that's helpful and useful, and informs not just your investors or your regulators, but also yourselves, your board and your management. That's number 2. Number 3, focus on emissions. We are going to go into a very complex world if we do not bring emissions down relatively quickly. There's some arguments that say a lot of the problems we face are now baked in, but emissions, as somebody said on a call I was on the other week, ESG is really important, but if we don't solve climate change, ESG will be the least of our problems, which I thought was a very interesting statement. I had to agree with them.
Absolutely. Roger?
Yeah, it's a bit of a summary, I think, from what we discussed, right? First of all, I agree with what Kevin's top 3. I will add a couple. So as we discussed in the beginning, make a clear map of your supply chain, in particular your direct suppliers, but also your indirect suppliers, so 4th, 5th, 6th party, understand what they're doing, and in particular the critical ones, identify those. Yeah, Kevin said use tech or leverage tech, use data and initial screening to perform then afterwards in-depth due diligence on the critical suppliers and the ones with a higher risk profile from that data screening perspective. I think that could be a very important one. And the last one is industry harmonization. So back to my last point.
Yeah,
so ensure
absolutely.
transparency, comparability, and achieve efficiency, because that's such an high operational.
Absolutely. We could achieve so much more if we collaborated more, like you said, and had some standardization. And Maria, last words from you.
Yes, not to duplicate, because I agree with the 3 priorities from Roger and Kevin. So I would say focus on your most material resupply chain or top products emitting CO2. Just focus the actions and resources on this. Use sustainability as a competitive advantage, partnering with suppliers, in the sector or across sectors. And the 3rd takeaway would be, don't give up, one supplier at a time, 1 CO2 ton at a time. And this is the right moment. It's a moment of actions, and we need to join the club. Yeah.
Exactly. Absolutely. We should celebrate every success along the way, even if they're very small ones. That's a really good point to make. Thank you so much. We're out of time and over time, but I think that was a really interesting discussion. So thank you very much. And thank you for our audience for posting some questions. So like I said, this is our 2nd seminar series in a series of 3, and the next one's coming up in a couple of weeks' time, and we will send you the link to that to register, and we'll put that in the chat, and we will follow up with that as well. This session has been recorded, so you can watch back, share with your colleagues, and it will be great to see you at the next one. Until then, thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.